ultimately the lesson is that the people themselves have to take responsibility for what they want their community to be.
The thing I learned about those days, that the people who were courageous were the women.
Where did the leadership come from? It came from the women. God bless the women.
It was the Women's Emergency Committee that did this tremendous job.
In the fall of 1957, Little Rock Central High School was scheduled to comply with the U.S. Supreme Court decision concerning segregation. The high school was to be integrated by 9 Negro, as they were called then, children, soon nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. These children were handpicked for their stability and academic achievements. Daisy Bates and her husband, L.C., led the movement and counseled the children daily. The city appeared ready for the first day of integration.
We thought we were prepared to be the example to the nation of the beginning of integration. We woke up the next morning with the declaration of the governor. We were back to the Civil War again.
Governor Orville Faubus, in what many historians think was a political maneuver, circled Little Rock Central High with the Arkansas National Guard and denied the Little Rock Nine entry into the high school.
His excuse for doing so was that there would be mob violence. And there was a mob out there around Central High, but I think that the mob was created by a lot of Governor Faubus's supporters and friends as justification for calling out the guard and stopping these children from attending the school.
Television was a new medium, and as news events were broadcast worldwide, Little Rock was branded a city filled with hate. A meeting was quickly arranged between Governor Faubus and President Eisenhower. They were to meet and reconcile the problem in Newport, Rhode Island.
I was on the extension when Governor McMath talked to Nixon and says, "This is a terrible mistake. Faubus will put his own spin on it, and I think he'll build him up to the point that we can never head him off down here." He came back to a tremendous crowd. The adulation was extreme, and I think he became completely intoxicated.
Upon his return to Little Rock, Faubus removed the Arkansas National Guard from Central High School and told the school to proceed with integration. This left the Little Rock police to secure the peace. It was an explosive situation. The Little Rock Nine were ushered in a side door. The mob became more violent, and before anyone got seriously hurt, the Little Rock Nine were sped away to safety by the city police. That night, President Eisenhower signed papers deploying the 101st Airborne to take over, and by nightfall, the Screaming Eagles descended on Little Rock.
In the name of God, whom we all revere, in the name of liberty we hold so dear, in the name of decency which we all cherish, what is happening in America?
The next day, the Little Rock Nine were escorted up the front steps. After a very rough beginning, school officially began on an integrated basis, September 25, 1957.
That year passed without a great deal of incident because you had this highly disciplined group that was picking these children up and taking them to school. And of course the mob couldn't take on the 101st, and so the mob dispersed after a time.
In May of 1958, Ernest Green, the only senior of the Little Rock Nine, graduated from Little Rock Central High School. Martin Luther King attended his graduation ceremony. The Arkansas Gazette spoke out against Faubus and became the target of a segregationist-led boycott. Even their paperboys were threatened. A McCarthy-like atmosphere pervaded the city.
Major voice for good and sanity. Decency was obviously the Arkansas Gazette. And the Arkansas Gazette suffered, gargantuan.
Oh, no question about it. It was an organized boycott in which Orville Faubus and others were, at least indirectly, which they were encouraging.
The Gazette lost, countless thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in subscriptions and in advertising.
On the national level, the Gazette was honored with 2 Pulitzer Prizes for their coverage of the integration crisis. This was the first time in history 2 Pulitzers were awarded to the same publication. Editor Harry Ashmore and publishers Ned Highschool and Hugh Patterson were honored at a dinner party. 3 women helped organize that event. Those 3 women would change Little Rock's history. Adolphine Fletcher Terry, the daughter of a slaveholder, Confederate soldier, and mayor of Little Rock. She was the wife of D.D. Terry, a New Deal congressman. In 1958, Mrs. Terry was 76 years of age. A graduate of Vassar, she was active in the women's suffrage movement. Her devotion to Arkansas was so strong, she's said to have described it as holy ground.
She was a wealthy woman, and she used her wealth and influence for good causes all her life.
Vivian Brewer grew up in Little Rock. She was married to Joe Brewer. They lived on Bearskin Lake just outside of Little Rock. She was in her 50s at the time and was a Smith College graduate. Her father had also been mayor of Little Rock. She had known Mrs. Terry before the dinner, but had met Velma Powell during the event.
Adolphine and Vivian were both very, very bright, both brilliant women. Their graciousness to people was just a part of their background.
Velma Powell was born and raised in Monticello, Arkansas, and was 37 at the time. Her husband, J.O. Powell, was vice principal of Little Rock Central High. Mrs. Powell had lived with the Terry family for over a year while attending business school in Little Rock and had become close to the Terrys. She was very active in civil rights matters and was the secretary of the Arkansas Council on Human Relations. During the year before, she and her husband had worked diligently on the crisis. Faubus's landslide victory of a third term gave him added momentum to try to block integration again. He called an extraordinary session in August, weeks before school was to begin.
Governor Faubus had complete control of the legislature. I mean, they did his bidding because they were terrified of his political influence.
Several bills were passed specifically designed to block integration and to dispense with opposition.
One of the measures that he passed was the recall measure to allow the segregationists to recall members of the school board that they didn't approve of.
And rumors began to spread that the governor might close the high schools in the city. The city waited for a U.S. Supreme Court decision concerning the delay of integration in Little Rock. Tensions were mounting in the community. The Supreme Court decision was announced on Friday, September 12, 1958, a very busy day in Little Rock. The ruling was unanimous. Integration would proceed. The school board ordered the high schools to open the following Monday, September 15th. One school board member resigned. Governor Faubus signed into law all the legislation from the extraordinary session, and with this action, he closed all 4 high schools in the city. Over 3,600 high school students and their families were affected by his actions. Downtown at the Terry Mansion, 3 women met.
Velma wrote Miss Terry a letter, and she said to her, now, whenever there's been trouble in Little Rock, you've always been the one who's tried to help. Where are you now?
We were desperate, and we had to have her leadership. And she called me, and I went over, and we had a meeting, and in the meantime, we had seen Vivian in action, and so the next day we called, and it got Vivian there.
So the 3 of us met at Mrs. Terry's and decided that we would form a study group
Over the weekend, they phoned their friends and set a meeting for Tuesday, September 16th.
Our first meeting, when we had 58 women there, much to our surprise, we had thought we'd be lucky to get 20 or 25.
Because in the meantime, Faubus had closed the schools.
We had been invited to come if we were interested, and we were very interested to see who came. We sat there and watched who was coming in, and we had to sign our names as we came in. Some woman got up and said, well, look, my sons are out of school, and I want to do something about that. Never mind the social part of it. Let's get down to business.
When Vivian started speaking, then that was it. I mean, this was the job the women were going to do, and we did it.
They developed a name for their group, the Women's Emergency Committee to Open Our Schools.
This organization, they felt in the beginning, needed to be white women who could convince their neighbors that they were not just there to integrate, but to build public education. There was an election coming up in 2 weeks, and they decided that they wanted to get involved in that because it was a very critical election that had been called because of a state law that Faubus and others had gotten through the state legislature that said that a community faced with integration had to vote either for integration or against integration. And it didn't say anything about the schools being closed, how people felt about that. The issues were for and against.
We were just first searching. Didn't know what to talk about, what was going to affect anybody.
They began by having small afternoon parties, then sending out flyers, trying to get their point across.
The closet supporters would come out if it was for public education. Forget all the race issues, forget all the social issues.
The WEC developed their strategy and a statement of policy. They were not for integration nor segregation, but for education.
People started to take sides, and the hostility was growing, from my perspective.
We lost a lot of friends during that time, couples that we'd eaten dinner with often and came to their house and they came to ours, and all of a sudden they disappeared. But we met so many other interesting people.
That's it.
That made up for it.
We came up with the idea with the history of public education, because all of us had to be reminded that there had not always been free public education.
In trying to reach more people, they went on radio and produced television programs, one with ministers and one with concerned civic leaders.
Bill Hadley chaired a TV panel for us. The next day, his public relations business was in shambles. This was why the men could not really come in the open, because they would lose their businesses.
In all fairness, there were some young leaders that were very committed to the same thing the women were. The town's power structure, the major leaders, were afraid to oppose Faubus.
Public schools were closed, but segregated Rainy High was opening. Faubus helped raise its funds and boasted that he'd lease public school buildings to private schools. The NAACP appealed, and the United States Supreme Court ruled against Faubus. Teachers began teaching their classes on television, and displaced students watched. The WEC had set up an office in the Capitol Hotel, but were annoyed by hecklers. The election was held on Saturday, September 27th. The WEC lost, but the more than 7,000 voters for integration made them realize they had supporters.
Well, we were all pretty much in the dumps, feeling isolated. But the election to me was very, very encouraging, because when you think that maybe, there might be a few hundred, and then all of a sudden you find out there's 7,000, it spurred us on.
We didn't win, but we got attention. We got people's attention. And we had contributions then started coming in. And most of them were anonymous. It was interesting. But we had contributions from all over the United States.
By voting against integration, the people of Little Rock had closed their 4 high schools. It was October, and parents were scrambling to find any schools that would accept their displaced teenagers.
They were shipping them all over Arkansas if they had any relatives. If they had enough money to send them to a private school outside the state, they would send them.
The women moved their office to a small room in a member's home and began working on increasing their membership.
I just knew that this organization had to grow to really, in my opinion, to be really effective. And so there were, the original list at that time was 200 members, but they would give $1 at that time, make a definite commitment.
The well-guarded WEC membership list was divided into regular members, members wanting mail in plain wrappers, members wanting nothing mailed to their homes, and anonymous members. Leaders of the WEC were accused of being, quote, nigger lovers, race mixers, and communists, end quote. Hate mail and tapped phones were the order of each day. In the repressive local atmosphere, being labeled an integrationist brought on harassment, threats, and social ostracism.
We knew we had the women out there. That was the League of Women Voters helped find women, and other sources, they just came out of the woodwork.
By late October, 600 brave women had paid the $1 joining fee, and the next election was at hand. Dr. Dale Alford entered the race against Congressman Brooks Hayes as a write-in candidate less than a week from the election.
We did turn out. We lost that one too.
Logical thinking, discussion on issues, just didn't get it because we got just cut off at the knees with this kind of emotion. If it could actually throw a man like Brooks Hayes out and have his church members turn their back on him. So that's when we kept talking about, so we got it back to the children, and their education.
On November 12th, the 5 moderate school board members bought out Superintendent Blossom's contract and resigned out of frustration.
The school board was getting hate calls and threats and bomb threats and everything else, and they weren't making any progress. The schools were closed. The teachers were sitting out there with no children to teach. They were discouraged and they quit.
The WEC had 3 days to find 6 candidates who believed in public education. Adolphine Terry began calling Little Rock's silent elite, while the WEC volunteers worked furiously to obtain enough signatures for the candidates to file. Others verified legitimate petition signatures. Precinct secretaries were organized. Different committees distributed cards, telephoned, mimeographed, stuffed envelopes, and supplied rides to the polls.
We had 18 committees. We could get a committee to do almost anything, and we had a sending out flyer committee. Some of the women were willing to come by and pick up envelopes. I can see you with all those babies picking up those envelopes, and they would take them to their house and maybe stuff them.
On December 6th, 3 of the WEC moderates were elected: Ted Lamb, Russell Matson, and Everett Tucker. And 3 segregationists won from the opposing side. The school board was divided right down the middle. It was a cold winter. Efforts to enlist local ministers' support by running a newspaper ad in favor of public education brought disappointing results.
We promised them that we would not use their names unless we could get 40 people. We wouldn't even run the ad until we got 40 people.
Only 25 out of 400 would agree to sign. The ad was never run. And at Christmas time, the WEC penned their letter from Little Rock.
We had a Christmas letter telling them how unhappy we were. We wanted the people out over the United States to know that we were very much ashamed of what our governor had done and that we were working hard.
Finally, in January of 1959, a sole business leader spoke out. Granger Williams, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, took the opportunity of his inauguration speech to take a public stand in support of public schools. The legislature was back in session at the state capitol, and they were hard at work passing bills to undermine integration. But this time, the Women's Emergency Committee was present.
Well, I don't mean to denigrate any of our women because they all had wonderful skills. It was just that they utilized them in different ways. And we did, the first group we sent out were perhaps AAUW ladies who had knew what the legislation was all about, knew when they were introducing a bill that we did not want passed. The men in the legislature just were not accustomed to these women who knew probably more than they knew, confronting them. And we were called and told that we were not being effective because of this. So then we decided, well, maybe we could get some sincere women who felt that it was our Christian or Judeo-Christian or whatever you want to call it, duty to integrate the schools and not have all this problem. And so we had a group go out and appeal to them on that, you know, quote the scriptures and that sort of thing, because that's what the other side was doing, you know. God did not mean the races to mix. And they'd quote scripture to us, so we were quoting scripture back to them. But they didn't have much time for that. And we had some beautiful young women in our group, young mothers who could see the future and knew that we had to have. And actually, Pat was the chairman of that group. And she was a gorgeous young woman. She was very much interested. She was brilliant. She could interpret that legislation better than they could. They didn't know what they were voting on. She knew what they were going to vote on. And we had a group of, and they wore their hats and their gloves, their white gloves, and they went out there.
We were treated very courteously. And we were treated pretty much as curiosity because they really didn't know what to do with us. And as Mrs. Terry had taught us, that Southern men and gentlemen who considered themselves gentlemen were not rude to you. They were nice to you. And so they had to behave. They had to courteously listen. If you got them coming out of the restroom, if you got them coming out of the whatever. In those days, you could actually go on the floor. They started to listen to us, really, and I think that's the main thing, was just to get their ear. And they also saw, if day after day, we had people who were interested enough to come and realize that we did have a constituency.
Representative Tom Tyler's bill would allow Faubus to pack the school board with his appointments. The bill did pass the House of Representatives, but after much lobbying from the WEC, it was tabled in the Senate by Senator Ellis Fagan. It was a breakthrough. By early March, the segregationists were beginning to fear a growing moderate coalition. It was about this time that the City Board of Directors demanded the WEC turn over their highly secret and protected membership list.
Police came to my door and handed me a subpoena that I was to give them the membership list, and I told them I didn't have my membership list.
They had a bill that you had to turn over your membership list. It was but passed in order to force the NAACP list. But they were going to apply it to us, and if we did not turn it over, we might be subject to a jail sentence. And we were saying, well, we'd look pretty good down there in jail if they had the nerve to, Jane's...
Oh, I remember that well. Let's face it, how many of us have been dragged off to jail for any offense, much less to not turn over a membership list.
The WEC kept their promise and did not divulge the names of their members. On May 5, 1959, public opinion received the jolt the WEC had hoped for. At a regular meeting of the school board, the annual renewal of teacher contracts was on the agenda. There were rumors of a segregationist purge.
I was sent down to the school board meeting because we had heard rumors of what they were going to be doing. And so I dutifully sat there, and I was surrounded by the White Citizens Council people because they had organized the attack. And so I remember they kept talking about the circle and breaking the circle. And if you did, it apparently had something to do with the Ku Klux Klan, and I didn't understand a lot about it, but it was meant to be a threat. But it was ominous.
After several hours of stalemate between the two factions, Tucker, Matson, and Lamb walked out of the meeting. They believed this would deny the school board a quorum. The remaining segregationist members continued, however, and proceeded to fire 44 teachers and administrators.
They purged 3 elementary school principals. The one at Forest Park, where all of the power structure people lived. These were all remarkable, talented teachers. That was a mistake to fire them.
I think their stated reason that the school board used to not renew their contracts was that they were integrationists or associates of integrationists. And so that was the excuse for not renewing the contracts. And so this infuriated everyone, including me.
The whole thing had taken a new turn. It was a fortunate turn for us because it was the focal point. That it got it off of the race issue, it got it off of Central High School. It was about mean people firing little elementary school principals. And it was a reason that a lot of people who had been afraid to step forward were going to come out.
Suddenly, there was a resounding cry from the community. Several businessmen met at a local restaurant and resolved that this latest action by the segregationists should not go unanswered. 2 days later, they formed STOP, the committee to stop this outrageous purge. The committee's objective was to recall the segregationist school board members with a recall law passed by Faubus in 1958. Nothing said the law couldn't be used against the segregationists. The segregationists also formed a group called CROSS, Citizens to Retain Our Segregated Schools. STOP campaign director Henry Woods knew exactly where to start.
I met him at Smith's drugstore up on the corner up in the Heights. The two of us sat, and they had served sodas back in those days, and we sat there.
And we talked about what could be done in the campaign, and I volunteered, whatever services I could render, that I would help them in any way I could.
Each side had 3 days to obtain valid signatures of 15% of the voters, enabling them to have a recall election. The race was on.
You had to be a registered voter, and which meant you had to pay poll tax to be able to sign the petition. So someone had to do that because a lot of people signed, and we couldn't do that screening ahead of time.
In the weeks following the teacher purges, WEC members solicited over 9,000 signatures in support of recalling the segregationist school board members. STOP workers set up at War Memorial Stadium, where petition signatures could be gathered and notarized in a drive-in office.
We got the word out, and people were it was great. We couldn't keep up with the cars coming in. We said, you don't have to get out of your car. Just come by and sign our petition. We let them know what we were going to do and what we hoped to attain. And the response was terrific as far as I'm concerned. Recall that this was an era when after votes, and they did do some checking, there were a lot of people that had been in the cemetery for many years on the list. And this is why we checked and double-checked that we, at least, were legitimate.
The segregationists were hard at work, too. The labor people had joined the fight.
There were some labor leaders who told us how they did it. I always thought Chicago. And I had never, and they called it the sweep. What did you sweep? You didn't start up here at the precinct, you didn't start at the big places, you started right down at the block to block level. What we had to do was get someone who would cover their block. If they wouldn't do the block, at least one side of the street, if they would tell us. Go ahead.
They were called door knockers.
Door knockers.
Vigorous radio, TV, and print campaigns followed. The WEC phone chain filled Robinson Auditorium.
Within 24 hours, we decided to honor the teachers. And so everybody on the chain had to drop everything and get their members there, period. And they all came through. It was just they're just beautiful people.
This was before computers, and each task was done completely by hand.
We had to make up a card for every voter on that list in the Little Rock School District, and that we had to identify how they were, whether they were on our side, the saints, on the other side, the sinners, and the savables, the people that were in the middle that hadn't made up their mind. We had to try to convert them. And that then after we identified the people that were for us, then we had to get our people to the polls.
We knew that we had to have each block and that we had to know where to go that day, who was going to go pick them up and take them to the polls, and to be sure that we did not take anybody who was going to vote the other way.
I told them that I felt like that the majority of whites here were probably going to be opposed to us. The whole community, to a certain extent, was in the grip of this hysteria. The African Americans were marked with a C on the poll for colored. And so you had the poll tax list, which was obtainable. I mean, they published booklets. And so I told her that we could assume that the blacks were going to be with us.
Well, it was the black vote.
That's
We knew that. We didn't have to poll the blocks to see how they were going to vote.
From ward captains to door knockers, the WEC organization was a well-oiled political machine. The men of STOP directed the recall campaign outwardly, but it was the women of the WEC who did the work, and it was the WEC's ward organization that ultimately made the difference on Election Day. The STOP campaign was victorious. All three of the Cross School Board members were recalled, and Faubus finally suffered a setback.
We had all these women that were so charged up and were just spent night and day. And that's what it took to win this election, because it was a narrow victory. And all these kids, very narrow victory.
This victory and the subsequent appointment of 3 more moderates to the school board paved the way for the reopening of the city high schools that fall. The women spent their summer compiling the Little Rock Report. The report confirmed suspicions that the integration crisis was taking a terrible toll on Little Rock's economy. Late in July, the school board adopted a pupil placement plan. Ted Lamb came up with the brilliant idea to open the schools early, which would prevent Faubus from calling a special session of the legislature. Faubus did, however, try to avoid the early opening by claiming a polio epidemic scare. Lamb contacted Jonas Salk, and Salk sent a telegram dispelling Faubus's fears. On August 12, 1959, the Little Rock Public High Schools reopened peacefully, with African American students enrolled in all high schools. Hall High School, Horace Mann, Metropolitan Tech, and Central High School opened quietly. Meanwhile, a crowd of approximately 1,000 had gathered at the state capitol, carrying signs saying race mixing is communism, among others. Faubus appeared and spoke to a standing ovation. The mob then headed for Central High, where the city police stopped them 1 block from the school. The mob was dispersed this time with fire hoses. In September, a year to the month of their beginning, the WEC changed their name and their policy. They became the Women's Emergency Committee for Public Schools. They knew, however, that they were still needed. On September 7th, Labor Day evening, dynamite shattered the calm. The school board office, the mayor's office, and the fire chief's home were all involved. Within 72 hours, 5 suspects, all from Little Rock, were apprehended and charged with the bombings. Eventually, all 5 men were convicted. For the next 4 years, the Women's Emergency Committee continued to oppose Faubus and work in support of public education for all people. On November 5, 1963, the Women's Emergency Committee for Public Schools announced the end of their existence, but the memory of their courageous efforts will live on. Even though the Women's Emergency Committee is barely more than a footnote, if mentioned at all in the published accounts of the Central High School crisis at Little Rock, it will be long remembered in the hearts of those who believe in what they stood for. Some parting editorials. Little Rock was where the first shock of a major battle was felt, but it was also the place where the tide first began to turn. Those of us that shared the same command post under fire have never doubted that the outcome would have been somewhat different had it not been for the selfless volunteers of the Women's Emergency Committee. If the men of Arkansas had more self-respect, they would bow their heads at the demise of the Women's Emergency Committee of Little Rock. In essence, the committee took the lead after this state's so-called leadership had either gone over to the side of retrogression and racism or had fled through the nearest available exit. The ladies now passed the seals of leadership back to their conventional custodians. These custodians ought to be on notice, however, that the committee could be put together again in an afternoon, and doubtless will be should the need arise. The ladies now disband, and thus signal the end of an era in which they were one of the few things to be remembered with pride.
I don't care whether I or any black is invited to somebody's party or wedding reception or what have you. That isn't integration. Integration is human dignity.